I've been driving trucks for about 10 years now. There's something about the open road at night that's both calming and eerie. The quiet hum of the engine, the vast emptiness of the highway, and the sense that you're the only person awake for miles. It's a strange feeling. You get used to it though. At least I thought I had. This happened about 5 years ago, and I still think about it whenever I drive past a certain stretch of highway. It was late, well past midnight, and I had just picked up a load from a small town in the middle of nowhere. The route was long and mostly deserted. No rest stops for hours, no other cars, just me and the long stretch of road. I was doing a night haul, something I usually didn't mind, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the weather. The air felt heavy, and a thick fog started to roll in, making visibility worse than usual. I was driving slower than I normally would, trying to make sure I didn't miss a turn or end up in a ditch. After a couple of hours, I noticed my fuel gauge was lower than I expected. There wasn't a gas station in sight, but I remembered passing a sign for one a few miles back. I didn't have much choice, so I turned around at the next break in the road and headed back the way I came. As I drove through the fog, I noticed something strange. The sign I had seen earlier, the one that pointed to the gas station, was gone. I thought maybe I had missed it in the fog, but the road didn't seem right either. The trees were thicker, and the asphalt was cracked and worn, like it hadn't been maintained in years. I told myself I was just tired. It was late after all. But then my headlights caught something up ahead, a small, dimly lit gas station, its sign flickering weakly in the mist. I hadn't seen it before. I was sure of that. But there it was, just off the highway. I pulled in, relieved to find a place to refuel. The station looked old, almost abandoned. The paint was peeling off the walls, and one of the windows was boarded up. There was no other car in sight, just my truck, and the cold, damp fog that seemed to cling to everything. I got out and started pumping gas. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and gasoline. I glanced around, feeling uneasy. There was a small building attached to the station, probably a convenience store, but it looked dark inside. Still, I thought I should go in and pay. The bell above the door jingled weakly as I stepped inside. The place was empty. Shelves were half-stocked with dusty cans and snacks, but there was no one behind the counter. I called out, but no one answered. I waited a few minutes, hoping someone would show up. I wasn't in a rush, but the longer I stood there, the more I wanted to leave. There was something off about the place, something I couldn't put my finger on. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone lightly knocking on wood. It came from the back of the store, near a door that led to what I assumed was a storage room. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the stillness. No answer. The tapping continued, slow and steady. I walked toward the door, my boots echoing on the old wooden floor. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached for the door handle. My hand hovered for a moment before I grabbed it and pulled the door open. The room was empty. Just a small, dimly lit space with a few shelves and boxes stacked against the walls. I stepped inside, squinting to see better in the weak light. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, spinning around to see if someone was there, but the store was still empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed back to the door and pulled it open. The store was just as I had left it, silent, empty, and eerie. I needed to leave. I didn't care about paying anymore. I was about to bolt for the door when I heard the tapping again, this time from outside the store. I stopped in my tracks, dread crawling up my spine. The sound was louder now, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of my truck. I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The fog was thicker now, almost suffocating. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, but I could hear the tapping. It was coming from the back of my truck. I walked slowly toward it, my heart racing. Every instinct told me to get in the cab and drive away, but I couldn't. I had to know what was making that sound. I reached the back of the truck and peered around the side. The tapping stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the fog, crouched by the rear tires of my truck. It was small, too small to be a person. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a stray dog. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't. It looked like a child, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, her back turned to me as she tapped on the tire with her tiny hand. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond, she just kept tapping. I took another step closer, my breath catching in my throat. The girl was wearing a dirty, old-fashioned dress, and her hair hung in tangled clumps down her back. There was something wrong with her. The way she moved, the way she tapped, it wasn't right. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but as soon as my hand got close, she stopped tapping and turned her head slowly to look at me. Her eyes were dark, hollow, like 2 empty pits staring right through me. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned and ran for the cab of my truck, fumbling with the door handle in my panic. I could hear footsteps behind me, small and quick, like someone running after me. I finally got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I didn't look back as I pulled out of the gas station and sped down the highway, the fog swallowing up the road ahead of me. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a truck stop far from that cursed stretch of highway. I sat in my cab, trying to calm down, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the fog had made me see things that weren't there. But when I checked the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the back of my truck, was a small handprint. I've been a trucker for about 12 years. In those years, I've driven through countless miles of highways, towns, and empty roads. Some hauls are smooth, others have bumps, but nothing ever really got under my skin. Well, at least not until this one job. This story happened a few years ago, and I still think about it when I'm out there on a lonely stretch of highway. It started like any other haul. I got a call from dispatch, asking me to pick up a load from a warehouse on the outskirts of a small town. It wasn't on any major routes, but jobs like that are common. I figured it was just another late-night run, a few hours of driving through empty roads with only the radio and my thoughts to keep me company. I packed a thermos of coffee and some snacks, checked my truck over, and headed out just before dusk. The weather was clear, no storms or fog, but there was a chill in the air that didn't seem to match the time of year. I brushed it off. Nights can feel colder out there on the open road, especially when you're alone. The route was straightforward enough, but as I drove farther from the city, the surroundings became emptier, almost desolate. No streetlights, no other cars, just endless stretches of road and trees. After about 2 hours, the GPS told me to turn onto a side road. The road wasn't even marked on my map, but I figured it was a shortcut to the warehouse. The side road was narrow, barely wide enough for my rig, and full of potholes. I slowed down, driving carefully to avoid any damage to the truck. As I drove deeper, the trees on both sides seemed to get closer, leaning in like they were trying to swallow the road. I kept the high beams on, but the darkness seemed thicker here, almost like the light was being sucked up by the night. After another 30 minutes of this winding, uneven road, I started to wonder if I'd missed a turn. The GPS was still telling me I was on the right track, but something felt wrong. The air was getting colder, and the truck's heater, which had been working fine, was now blowing nothing but cold air. It was strange, but not enough to make me stop. Finally, the GPS announced I'd arrived at my destination. I looked around, expecting to see the warehouse, but all I saw were trees and darkness. Confused, I pulled over to the side of the road and checked the address on the paperwork. The GPS was right, but there was no building, no lights, just an empty clearing up ahead. I thought about calling dispatch, but I had no signal. Great, I thought. Stuck in the middle of nowhere with no service and no sign of the warehouse. I decided to drive a bit further down the road, just to see if maybe the GPS was a little off. After another half-mile, I spotted something up ahead, a small building. It wasn't big enough to be a warehouse, more like an old office or guard shack, but it was the only structure I'd seen for miles. The building was run down, with cracked windows and peeling paint. There was a single light flickering above the door, barely enough to light up the entrance. I pulled the truck to a stop and climbed out, feeling the cold air hit me like a wall. Something about the place didn't feel right, but I needed to figure out where the warehouse was. I walked up to the door and knocked, half expecting no one to answer. After a few moments, I heard footsteps from inside, slow and deliberate, like whoever was inside didn't want to be heard. The door creaked open, revealing an older man standing in the doorway. He had a haggard look about him, with deep-set eyes and a face that seemed worn by years of hard living. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm looking for a warehouse. I've got a load to pick up, but the GPS brought me here. Is this the right place?" The man stared at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Warehouse, huh? Ain't no warehouse around here." I frowned. "But the address," he cut me off. "This is the place you're looking for, all right, but it ain't no warehouse. Not anymore." I didn't know what to make of that. "What do you mean? Is the building closed down or something?" He glanced over my shoulder at the truck, then back at me. "You're not the first one to come out here looking for something that ain't here no more." That sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to play it cool. "So, what do I do? I've got a schedule to keep." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped aside and motioned for me to come inside. "Best if you come in for a minute. There's something you ought to know." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive away, but curiosity, and maybe a little stupidity, got the better of me. I stepped inside. The interior of the building was just as run down as the outside. There were old, dusty chairs and a counter that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single lamp on the counter cast a dim yellow light over the room. The man closed the door behind me and walked over to a small table, where he motioned for me to sit. Reluctantly, I did. "You ever heard of Black Hollow?" he asked, leaning on the table. I shook my head. "No, should I have?" He let out a dry laugh. "Most folks haven't. It's a place that used to be around here, not far from where we are now. It was a small town back in the day. A lot of people lived there, worked there. Then one night, everyone disappeared. Just like that." I blinked, not sure what to say. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "I mean gone," he said, tapping his fingers on the table. "No trace, no bodies, no signs of a struggle. Just gone." "Sounds like an old ghost story," I said, trying to lighten the mood, but the man's expression stayed serious. "It's more than a story," he said. "That warehouse you're looking for? It used to be part of Black Hollow. But it's not there anymore. Not in the way you think." I didn't know how to respond to that. The whole thing sounded insane, but the look in his eyes told me he believed every word he was saying. "Look," I said, standing up. "I don't know what this is all about, but I need to get back on the road. If there's no warehouse, I'll call my dispatcher and figure out what to do next." The man didn't try to stop me as I walked toward the door, but just as I reached for the handle, he spoke again. "If you drive any further, you'll find it, but you won't like what you see." I paused, his words hanging in the air. Part of me wanted to ignore him and leave, but something about the way he said it made my stomach knot up. I turned back to him. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away, just looked at me with those tired, sunken eyes. Once you get there, you might not be able to leave. That was enough for me. I opened the door and stepped back outside into the cold night air. The fog had started to roll in, thick and heavy, covering the road ahead like a blanket. I climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the building. I told myself the guy was just messing with me. Maybe he was lonely, living out there in the middle of nowhere, and he wanted to scare me with some creepy story. But as I drove down the road, the fog grew thicker, and the temperature seemed to drop even more. I kept driving, hoping to find some kind of landmark or sign that would tell me I was heading in the right direction. But after another 20 minutes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Up ahead, through the fog, was a large building. It was the warehouse. The building was old, much older than I had expected. The walls were made of cracked, weathered brick, and the windows were shattered or boarded up. The place looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But there it was, standing at the end of the road like it had been waiting for me. I pulled the truck to a stop in front of the building, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the place felt wrong, like the air around it was heavier, darker. I wanted to turn around and leave, but I had a job to do. Maybe the guy was wrong. Maybe this was just an old building that still got used from time to time. I grabbed a flashlight from the cab and stepped out of the truck. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the front of the building. As I walked closer, I noticed something strange. There were no sounds. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just complete silence. I reached the entrance and shined my flashlight on the door. It was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing rows of rusted shelves and piles of debris. It didn't look like a functioning warehouse, that was for sure. But something else was off. The air inside felt wrong, like it was too thick, too heavy to breathe. I walked deeper into the building, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I called out, hoping someone might be there, but my voice just seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like something scraping against metal. It was coming from deeper inside the warehouse. I froze, listening. The sound was steady, like someone dragging something across the floor. I shined my flashlight toward the back of the building, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. I took a few steps forward, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The scraping stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then slowly, the sound started again, this time louder, closer. I backed up, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Something was wrong. I needed to get out of there. I turned and bolted for the door, my boots clattering on the concrete floor. Just as I reached the exit, I heard a loud bang behind me. I glanced back and saw something, a figure, moving in the darkness, coming toward me. I didn't stop to look. I ran out of the warehouse, slamming the door behind me, and jumped into the truck. I started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The fog was thicker than ever, but through it, I could see the warehouse, dark and still, like it had always been there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway. I pulled into a truck stop and called my dispatcher, telling him the load wasn't there, that something was wrong with the address. I never told him what I saw. To this day, I still don't know what it was. But every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, I think about that warehouse and the old man's words. Once you get there, you might not be able to leave. I didn't believe him then, but now I'm not so sure. I've been a truck driver for over 10 years. I've seen it all. Bad weather, long nights, endless stretches of empty roads. But there's one night that still haunts me. It was a simple job, or at least it was supposed to be. A late-night run, picking up a load from a warehouse I had never been to before. The address was on the edge of nowhere, but that wasn't unusual for this kind of work. I left just after sunset, hoping to make good time on the empty roads. The drive was quiet, nothing but the hum of my engine and the distant songs of insects outside. I was used to that kind of solitude. It was one of the things I liked about the job. But after a few hours, things started to feel off. I was driving down a narrow highway, the kind of road where there's barely enough room for two trucks to pass each other. There were no streetlights, and the trees lining the road seemed to press in from both sides, casting strange, long shadows on the pavement. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. I checked the GPS, but it said I was still on the right path, so I kept going. About an hour later, the fog rolled in. Thick, heavy fog, like a curtain falling over the road. My headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down, straining to see the lines on the road. I was getting closer to the address, but something didn't feel right. The air was colder than it should have been for that time of year, and the night was unnervingly silent. Finally, I reached a small, faded sign on the side of the road that read, Black Hollow Industrial Park. It looked old, like it hadn't been maintained in years, but according to the GPS, this was the place. I turned down a gravel road that led into the industrial park. The fog was even thicker here, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I had to crawl along at a slow pace, my tires crunching over the gravel. The buildings that appeared in my headlights looked abandoned, run-down warehouses with broken windows and weeds growing up through the cracks in the pavement. I kept driving, hoping to find the right building. I double-checked the paperwork. It was supposed to be Building 13. But none of the buildings had numbers on them, at least none that I could see through the fog. After creeping along for another 10 minutes, I spotted a large structure up ahead, its shape barely visible in the mist. I pulled up in front of the building and parked. The place looked even worse up close. The windows were shattered, and the door was hanging off its hinges. But this was the only building that looked big enough to be a warehouse, so I figured it had to be the right one. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the truck, and walked toward the entrance. The air was damp and cold, and the silence pressed down on me, thick as the fog. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the empty lot, and every crunch of gravel felt like it was disturbing something that should have been left alone. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't just hanging off its hinges, it was barely attached at all, as if someone had ripped it from the frame. I paused, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about turning back to the truck, but I had a job to do. So, I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The inside of the warehouse was dark and smelled of dust and mildew. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rows of rusted metal shelves and old crates stacked haphazardly in the corners. I called out, hoping someone might be there, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. I walked deeper into the building, the sound of my boots on the concrete floor the only noise in the place. The air felt thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I kept expecting to see something, another trucker, a worker, anyone, but the place was completely abandoned. I reached the center of the warehouse and stopped. The paperwork didn't say what I was supposed to pick up, only that it was a large shipment. But there was nothing here, just dust and debris. I pulled out my phone to call dispatch, but of course, there was no signal. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against metal. It was coming from deeper inside the building, behind a row of shelves that were covered in cobwebs. My heart skipped a beat. I shined the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam only revealed more shadows. "Hello?" I called out, but again, there was no response. I didn't want to go any further, but I had to find out what was making that noise. I walked slowly toward the back of the warehouse, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone or something was trapped back there. As I rounded the corner of the shelves, I saw it, a small metal door, half hidden behind some old crates. The door was rattling on its hinges, as if something on the other side was trying to get out. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There was no reason for a door like that to be here, not in a warehouse like this, and there was definitely no reason for something to be moving behind it. I turned to leave, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there, but before I could take a step, the door creaked open. At first, I couldn't see what was inside. The darkness beyond the door was too thick, too absolute. But then slowly, something stepped out. It was small, no bigger than a child, but its shape was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched and twisted. It moved in jerks like it wasn't used to walking on two legs. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The thing stopped in the doorway, turning its head toward me. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were nothing more than black holes, empty and staring. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, sprinting back through the warehouse as fast as I could. My footsteps echoed louder than ever, but I could hear something else behind me, the sound of scraping metal, growing closer. I burst through the broken door and ran to my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and jammed the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life, and I floored the gas, tearing out of the lot and back onto the gravel road. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The fog was still thick, but for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the distance, a dark shape, too tall and thin to be human, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway. I pulled into a truck stop, my hands shaking as I parked. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow in the fog. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I called dispatch and told them the warehouse was abandoned, that there was no load to pick up. They sounded confused, said they'd never heard of Black Hollow Industrial Park. I hung up without asking any more questions. I don't drive that route anymore, and every time I think about that night, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run. What would have happened if I had stayed? I've been a trucker for years, traveling across the country, hauling goods from one place to another. I enjoy the open road, the peace, and the long hours with just me and my thoughts. But there's one night I'll never forget. One that changed how I felt about those lonely, quiet roads forever. It started like any other job. I got a call from dispatch, telling me I had a late-night run to a warehouse about 3 hours away. The pay was good, and I didn't have anything else going on, so I accepted it without hesitation. I figured it would be an easy drive through the night. What could go wrong? I left the truck stop just before sundown. The highway was empty, the air cool and quiet. My headlights cut through the growing darkness as I cruised along the open road. After a few hours of smooth driving, the GPS told me to take a turn down a side road. That's when things started to feel strange. The road was narrow, with thick trees lining both sides. It was like the forest was closing in around me. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the pale beam of my headlights cutting through the shadows. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. I turned up the radio to fill the silence, but it didn't help much. Something about the road gave me an uneasy feeling, but I shrugged it off. It was just another late-night run. After about half an hour, the GPS told me I was getting close. I was supposed to pick up a load from a warehouse, but as I looked around, all I could see were trees and empty fields. No buildings, no signs of life. I started to wonder if I had taken a wrong turn, but the GPS insisted I was on the right track. Finally, I saw a sign on the side of the road. It was old and faded, barely readable in the dim light, but it said, Black Creek Warehouse, mile. I breathed a sigh of relief. I wasn't lost after all. I followed the road as it wound deeper into the woods, and soon I saw the building up ahead. The warehouse was huge, but it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The walls were cracked, and the windows were broken, with boards nailed haphazardly over some of them. There were no lights, no signs of activity, just darkness and silence. I pulled the truck into the gravel lot and parked near the entrance. The building loomed in front of me, its broken windows staring out like empty eyes. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the truck, feeling the cold night air settle around me. There was no one waiting outside, no other trucks or workers. It felt like I was the only person for miles. I walked up to the large metal door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. Inside, the air was musty and damp. My flashlight beam flickered over rows of old crates and dusty shelves. The warehouse was huge, but it felt dead, like it hadn't been used in years. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast space. No answer. The only sound was the soft hum of the wind outside. I walked further in, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the empty space. I was supposed to pick up a load, but there was no sign of it. In fact, there was no sign of anyone at all. The paperwork said the load would be ready and waiting, but the place was completely deserted. As I made my way toward the back of the warehouse, I heard something, a faint sound, like metal scraping against concrete. I froze, listening. It was coming from deeper inside the building. My heart started to pound in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. It was probably just an old piece of equipment shifting, or maybe a rat scurrying around. But then the sound came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate scraping, like something, or someone, dragging something heavy across the floor. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice shaking a little now. The only answer was the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. I took a few more steps forward, my flashlight flickering slightly as I moved. The scraping sound continued, growing louder, closer. I rounded a corner and shined the light down a narrow hallway at the back of the warehouse. That's when I saw it. There was something, or someone, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, with long, thin limbs hunched over like it was too big for its own body. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes were black, empty holes. The thing stared at me, unmoving. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then, the thing started to move. Slowly, it lifted one long arm and began to drag something across the floor. The scraping sound echoed through the hallway. I took a step back, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew I needed to get out of there. Fast. I turned and ran, my boots slapping against the concrete floor. Behind me, I heard the scraping grow louder, faster, like it was chasing me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see how close it was. I burst through the metal door and sprinted to my truck, my heart hammering in my chest. I jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, speeding out of the lot as fast as I could. As I drove back down the narrow road, my hands shaking on the wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the fog behind me, a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the trees. But then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway. My hands were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. What had I seen back there? Was it real, or was my tired brain playing tricks on me? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was for sure, I wasn't going back to that warehouse. I called dispatch and told them there was no load to pick up, that the place was abandoned. They sounded confused, said they didn't know anything about Black Creek Warehouse. They told me to forget about it and head to the next job. I didn't argue. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened that night. I still drive the same roads, still take late-night hauls, but I've never been back to that part of the woods. Sometimes late at night when I'm driving through a dark stretch of highway, I think about that thing in the warehouse, those black, empty eyes staring at me from the darkness. And every time, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting.